close associates, like the Pope family, for example, were very politically connected, also connected to organized crime, arguably, but we're very much in the business of making backroom deals, and that's how power, political power in the United States functions. And so, fundamentally, I think a lot of what Trump likes to focus on and promote about his political style is around negotiations, whether those are diplomatic negotiations or negotiations with businessmen that lead to big number investments he can tout to the public, which is, I think part of the impetus.
Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and enabling post notifications for more content on crypto and digital assets. Check out our other videos and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps with the YouTube algorithm and keeps the content coming. Thanks for your support. Enjoy the video.
Behind his having the Project Stargate press conference, at the White House on his first full day, at his second term. And I think that's also kind of consistent with what we saw from Trump during his first term as well. So when you're sort of focused on those metrics, I don't necessarily think that the focus is necessarily on how do I help everyday Joe. I'm sure that, in his mind, I don't really necessarily want to speak for him, but if you're, of the opinion that I'm going to tout this big multi-million-dollar investment in U.S. AI infrastructure, for example, perhaps he views that as an impact on people's ability to create, and what sort of impact will this have on society. And, these are things that I think sort of get left out of the public discussion, and I don't think they're really on someone like Trump's radar as a businessman. He's focused on sort of the bottom line, the number, the success of the negotiation, and how successful it looks, frankly, whether it's to his base or to businessmen he wants to court. Or, other people, foreign leaders, and, I'll stop there, I guess.
No, that was great. So how do you feel when you hear about AI creating this two-tier system?
Oh, I certainly don't think that's positive. I think it's sort of the technocratic model that we discussed earlier, where you sort of have an elite class that sort of set the system that will micromanage the masses at the end of the day. I mean, they don't explicitly say that in the book, but if you're familiar with someone like Henry Kissinger, for example, and some of his more controversial views on the masses and the public, and some of his more infamous quotes, that's sort of the mentality as I see it of someone like him. But obviously he's been, praised as a model statesman and all of this stuff, and has mentored Trump in his first administration, mentored Hillary Clinton, people on both sides of the aisle. But I personally, I think the more you look into someone like that and his connections with sort of dubious oligarchs like David Rockefeller going, significantly back in time, he's sort of someone that promotes this idea of a global technocracy.
Okay, so do you have the impulse to want to see AI slow down or stop?
Well, I don't necessarily want to say that I'm like a Luddite and we should all go back to the Stone Age or things like this, but I think there needs to be like an actual public discussion on this, particularly on the fact that our out of control national security state in Silicon Valley have essentially been fusing over the past few decades, and what necessarily that means. Because a lot of people will say stuff, well, it's AI in the private sector, but when that private sector company has multi-million dollars conflicts of interest with the national security state, I think that should, be part of the discussion necessarily. And I think also there needs to be created this public perception that AI is inherently smarter than human decision makers and more efficient and more cost effective, for example. I think these are kind of problematic scenarios that need to be considered. I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer or poo-poo on on innovation, but I think, civil liberties do matter. And I think people need to be very mindful of that, especially considering, again, the Silicon Valley fusion with the national security state and the national security state's tendency to opportunistically whittle down American civil liberties for their benefit.
It's It's a really interesting intersection that I clearly need to start thinking more about. The way that I would look at that, and this ties into something you mentioned earlier, during the inauguration of Donald Trump, you had all these tech billionaires there by him, and it certainly gave me like, ooh, this is why people are paranoid about oligarchy vibes. And I'm not super prone to that kind of thinking. So the fact that it hit me like that, I was like, okay, definitely it's good that people are being paranoid. But the intersection feels like it's a very natural intersection to me. So
I referred to earlier with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence and some of these FOIA documents that came out of there is the promotion of the idea that essentially the U.S. needs to do what China has done and replicate this civil military fusion model in order to win the AI arms race. And sort of the argument inherent in that is that in order to beat China, we must become China even more than China is. And a lot of the justifications, around China as an adversary are related to how China is not as protective of civil liberties as the United States at least postures itself as being, for example, and a major difference in the value system between China and the United States. And so if you're willing to adopt exactly that model, civil military fusion, in my opinion, is really not that different than fascism at the end of the day. It's the corporatist model, and I don't think it's necessarily what Americans want. And yeah, there is a majority-owned financial entity that was a big scandal for conservatives when Hunter Biden's Rosemont Seneca was also tied to it. But there's been no conservative uproar over this tie. And you have to kind of ask why that may be, and why you have a lot of these big tech people, Elon Musk included, who has a major role in the national security state of the United States, as one of the top contractors to Space Force in the Pentagon, for example, and Starlink. And all of these things, through Tesla, has a lot of ties to, Chinese commerce and tech giants that also have rather cozy relationships with the Chinese government as well. Why is that not being discussed as, a potential national security risk if we do really need to become China to beat China? You see what I'm saying? Like, if it was really, that was really the key driver of our issue, shouldn't we be scrutinizing the ties of these oligarchs to both China and, some in our own national security state? And, again, I think if people are familiar with my books and my work, there is a scandal that really exposed a lot of this that happened during the Clinton administration and was not properly investigated at all. It's remembered as relation to Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father. And he was very active in what he said was sort of smoothing over relationships between East and West during the Cold War. But essentially what he said in testimony to Congress in the early 70s is that there was the rise of what he called the trans-ideological corporation, where you essentially have the multinational corporations, many of them based in the West, making joint ventures with the communist-owned, state-owned enterprises in the East, Russia and China, and that these were essentially fusing to form an economic structure that was unaccountable to any government in the world. And when asked if he thought this development was a good thing, he essentially said, yes, it was. And that was back in the early 1970s, and nothing was really done about it. And you have to kind of ask why is that? And it's kind of interesting too for those that subscribe to the thesis of someone like Carol Quigley, who wrote many decades ago about the C or its private sector equivalents. And I think it's fair to say that, in countries like United States, where they don't want to have a CBDC, for example, private sector is going to produce it. And they've done that in many occasions to make it sort of, I think, more palatable, to a more liberty-minded public. It's not coming from the state, it's coming from the private sector, but ultimately, the end result in the policy is essentially the same. And so, in a sense, yes, I guess some would argue that is globalism in a nutshell. And technocracy, which I mentioned earlier, was an actual movement. And that particular movement built around this organization called Technocracy Inc., which the Canadian branch of which was led by Elon Musk's grandfather. That argued for the creation of all these different unions around the world, these different techniques, like a European Union, an African Union, a North American Union, etc. And that the goal was to sort of push that, some have argued, via the idea of this multipolar world, where you're sort of ending the unipolar model. And I think that's Chris in looking at major aspects of the Epstein case. And so, that's something I focused on in my book, obviously, but I think it's a very good example, in part due to the enduring public interest in that case. I think it very effectively shows that there are certain places that, despite the public interest, there are places most people will not go in terms of trying to investigate what really happened there and get to the truth of the matter. And this takes me back to my point earlier that people cannot make informed decisions without being empowered with knowledge, and that knowledge requires effective, unbiased reporting, and it requires transparency. And unfortunately, we have a major lack of both of those two things. And I think part of that is unfortunately because there really aren't a lot of investigative journalists anymore. And I think a lot of people in independent media, which is supposedly the new media now, are much more influenced by what, gets clicks and the algorithm than they are in following the stories that really matter, because that's not necessarily where the money is or where the clout is.
Yeah, there's certainly a fractal to open up there. I don't consider myself a journalist. I have no interest in becoming a journalist, and I do like what new media brings, but I don't like that journalism itself has been relegated.
Significant intelligence ties. Some of them, like Brock Pierce, have ties to pedophilia scandals that happened in the early 2000s. Tether since then has come under fire for being not transparent about its reserves, among other things. And it has also been memory hold its role in the FTX scandal, where you had Alameda Research being very involved with, the Tether supply and helping it maintain its peg, among other things. And if we, of course, know now that FTX was involved in all sorts of financial misconduct, for lack of a better word.
To put it nicely. Yeah.
Yes. And, Solana, which has been responsible for these pump and dump meme coins, among other things, was also very closely tied to Sam Bankman-Fried. He's been called one of the main reasons behind its rise in popularity, for what it since has become. And there's no shortage of examples of sort of pump and dump meme coins that have sort of rugged people of a lot of money, and what has that money ultimately led to, and who was ultimately responsible for that. And the idea about having freedom money or privacy money and all of that has sort of definitely taken a back burner and may disappear entirely from the discourse. And I personally don't see that as positive. I think if we're going to move into the digital money space, and there's this push to eliminate cash, I think anonymity and privacy is important. The argument is that, well, bad people will use it to money launder and all of this stuff. And sure, that's true. But even if we go into a new digital system, I really doubt that the CIA and some of these other entities that engage in that same type of behavior will be forced to stop. I think it'll be money laundering for me and not for thee kind of thing. And also a lot of people that use those, privacy enhancing protocols and products aren't money launderers. They just don't like mass surveillance, which again was part of the, early Freedom of Information Act requests. Essentially suggests that the roadmap to doing so is to impose lots of domestic surveillance and AI-powered surveillance technology on the American public as a way to sort of leapfrog China, because they argue that China has already done that and thus has a much larger user base and data set for all of these different AI technologies. And so in order to outdo them, we must drastically increase our user base of these AI technologies, which includes things they say like, surveillance, as I mentioned earlier, facial recognition, expanding that, expanding e-commerce, reducing in-person shopping, and really, other in-person activities, including healthcare, in-person doctor visits, moving to telemedicine as much as possible. And this was really a big focus of that commission, which was the meeting of the national security state and the big tech industry in the years prior to COVID-19. And a lot of that push into the digital realm would be scaled to really to levels that the original designers of the panopticon concept probably couldn't even fathom back at the time.
Okay, so then just breaking it down, pan all over, optic, presumably sight. So omniscient sight, basically, or omnipotent sight. Okay, cool. Totally understand. Now, I have a feeling that as we talk today, that underlying the conversation that we're about to have is this idea of liberty versus security and the trade-off there. If you were going to plant a flag in your own life and give us a breakdown of how you see that trade-off, is it 100% liberty and I don't care what that means for security, or is it some kind of balance?
Well, it's hard. I would rather start with a paraphrase of a rather well-known quote of Benjamin Franklin's, which goes something along the lines of those who trade their liberty for security,
Comment around the reality of this stuff. You said that there's a discrepancy between how you'd feel about it in an ideal world versus the world we actually live in. So the concerns around, would this be, one, can it be trusted? Certainly a big question. Two, are there liberty constraints that would become so problematic as to the cure being worse than the disease? So those are the things that it sounds like you run into when you look at the reality of this stuff being deployed. Talk to me, though, about the ideal world. Is this stuff that you wish that we could deploy, but you just know in the hands of humans we can't trust it? Or even in an ideal world, your take would be very different?
Well, I think in an ideal world, this type of stuff to tackle crime and illness wouldn't really be necessary, quite frankly. But I guess it depends on what your definition of the ideal world is. And I guess sort of in the scenario, is the government trustworthy? I guess in that scenario, in markets as well.
Okay, de-risking things doesn't sound immediately negative. Why is de-risking bad? Or why does it yield bad outcomes?
So, if you want to, take risk to zero that there will be crime in a particular area, the type of interventions you would have to impose would be pretty significant, right? It doesn't sound bad when you phrase it that way necessarily. And that's why I was phrasing it that way, because I think that's how these people in elite circles tend to think about it. Ultimately, at the end of the day. And they don't really, if you're the CIA, for example, you don't really want to have to be more transparent and more accountable for things you have done in the past. I think that's been pretty clear with their history as an agency. But they'd be more interested in eliminating lead people's lives and micromanage people's lives in particular directions. And I certainly don't agree with that. As I said earlier, I personally would like people to be empowered to make their own decisions. And a lot of that is through education and having the freedom to make those decisions. And sometimes making your own decisions can lead to failure and maybe not the best outcomes. But I mean, that's how people learn and adapt and evolve. And I think it's necessary for people to be able to do those things. I mean, as a parent, it's important to, ensure that my kid has the freedom to, not necessarily succeed all the time, because you learn important lessons and you build character from not getting things right on the first try, and to have things micromanaged to prevent any sort of coercion involved there. And sort of elucidating the facts of the situation would empower people to make their own decisions. If people can be shown that there is sort of a fear element here and a coercive and manipulative element to it, I'm sure the decisions they would take would be a little different. The utility of manufacturing consent via fear is that when people are afraid, they tend to not think critically and they tend to act impulsively and emotionally. And they tend to look for easy solutions. And so if you have you've created fear in the public and then you offer a tailor-made solution, you can more easily get consent that way. But if people are empowered to know that the situation has been manipulated to force that outcome, I'm sure a lot of them would make different decisions, and that can algorithm in the way of the content that you wish to follow. Consider signing up directly to sites newsletters, or looking into RSS feed readers, for example, where you can design your own news feed and not have the algorithm dictate what you see and don't see. So yeah, those would be the places to follow me. I only have a Twitter account, which is under my name, and a Telegram channel. That is the site, the name of my website, Unlimited Hangout. If you see something that looks like me on Facebook or another site, I can guarantee you it's not me. I've had some issues with imposter accounts, as I'm sure most people in this space have had at one time or another. So